Okay. So what Sarah had been talking about was you feel like sometimes you get hit with something and you think, I need to write an addendum for that, but I don't know how to word it. And there's got to be something out there. There probably is something out there. And so the first place to look is always to check on the MLS and just look on the forms. We're technically not supposed to write verbiage or create addenda because we're not attorneys. We're not supposed to practice law, but as soon as we do anything, besides fill in the blank on this, we're technically practicing law. And so I had a lawyer explain in one of the courses I took, the reason we can do this within limits is that the state courts have recognized that in order for us to do our job, we sometimes have to alter the existing approved form. But when we write addenda and write anything, you need to be as specific as possible in the wording and use the correct terminology. So for example, Curtis Bullock had to send out a circular last year when a lot of agents were writing offers that made the earnest money non-refundable upon acceptance. And they had multiple complaints come through where the wording on the addendum was, earnest money shall be hard upon acceptance.
Oh my gosh.
Hard is not a technical term.
No.
It's not a legally recognized term. So technically they had no legally enforceable addendum because it wasn't worded legally. So if one of the parties wanted to get out of it, particularly the buyer, well, the buyer, I'd say, well, that's not a legally defensible term. That's hard is not a legal term. You quit doing that.
Yeah.
Non-refundable is in the contract. Use the contract terminology. If we're changing deadlines, drives me nuts when I get an addendum and all it says is settlement deadline and then a date. Go specifically to the contract and state, as per paragraph 24D, settlement deadline shall be. Now you're using the wording from the contract. As much as possible, if you're changing anything, copy and paste the original wording and then make the changes you need to. So you've got the reference to the paragraph or wherever it is in the original contract or the addendum. Sometimes addendum can just be silly. I had a transaction where the listing agent had sent an addendum over as part of the process and had the same number as a prior addendum. We ended up with 2 addendum number 4.
Yeah.
An underwriter saw that and wouldn't let it go through underwriting with 2 addendum 4.
Yeah.
So he had to actually write an addendum 6, renumbering addendum 4 with that date as addendum 4, addendum 5 with this date. This shall be addendum 6, and all subsequent addenda shall be numbered in order.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes you have to get crazy. Our favorite one, Sarah, was the one that Marty was involved with, where we had a situation where the home was being purchased in late winter. There was a dog on the property. Buyers didn't want to have to move in and have dog poop on the yard if it was underneath the snow. And so seller agreed that in the event that there was snow on the ground and they were not able to clean up the dog poop, they would provide a $500 gift certificate to Dr. Scoopy Poo. As who would then, it was a guy that provides the service under the name of Dr. Scoopy Poo. And Marty kept a copy because he's like, never am I ever going to get to use the phrase Dr. Scoopy Poo in an addendum ever again.
Can we try though?
Can we really? Yeah. So we're going to go over, we went over the short addenda yesterday, short sale addenda and short-term lease back. And we'll try to get to those at the end of these again, because some folks were absent. But what we're going to be looking at are some addendum today that affect agents specifically, that refer to agent relationships as part of the purchase process. This first one is one that oftentimes kind of gets either not used enough, it gets underutilized, or overutilized. There's like no middle of the road on this. And this is the disclosure of interest form that is required in the event that an agent has some kind of interest that has to be disclosed in writing. So the disclosure of interest is really, you just pick the appropriate blank. If an agent is acting as a principal If you as an agent are purchasing a property or selling a property, you are a principal in that as an agent owner or agent buyer. You have to disclose whether if you're the buyer or the seller, is a practicing real estate agent. That's required by law. It has to be expressed in writing. You have to disclose the other side that you are an agent. If you are buying or selling as a principal. The one that's a little more difficult to sometimes get around or feel where do we need to go is if you are representing family. If the buyer or seller you represent is a relative of some kind. Sarah, how far out do you think that goes?
Ooh, that's a really good question, actually.
How far would you go?
Any question about it at all?
Yeah.
And I guess if I have knowledge that we are related, I would probably disclose that. If I don't have knowledge that we are related, and found out later, oh, we're fourth cousins. I probably wouldn't, because I didn't know.
Okay, the state standard is, under the state guidelines, is in R162, immediate family.
So like a first cousin is not, you don't have to disclose that?
And then they define immediate family as parents or step-parents, children, siblings.
Okay. Interesting.
Now, if it's
My cousin buy a house, I wouldn't have to disclose,
technically you wouldn't have to.
but
I've represented my wife's nephew and his wife. I went ahead and disclosed it.
yeah.
I feel like if anything were to ever come up and a complaint or something, would just be better, right?
Yeah, Ty, that's a good point. It's
Yeah.
better to over disclose
Yeah,
than to under disclose.
Mhm.
because if someone ever tries to like make some claim that you know, had some other interest or something, it would just be better to be like, well, we already told you.
Yes. And we're under legal obligation to disclose if we have any kind of familial relationship with the principals we represent in writing. This just formalized it so that it's part of the process. So if it's cousin, aunt, uncle, grandparent, you're better off over disclosing, knowing that the law requires immediate family. With my son and daughter-in-law, obviously I was going to disclose that. Even though my daughter-in-law at that point, the divorce had been finalized. I still needed to disclose because I had a 7-year relationship with her. Where this sometimes gets misused is when it's an owner agent. If you are a principal at all in the transaction, it has to be disclosed. And it could be an ethics
With this?
on this. So that's what the second one is. The first one is if you're a relative. Second is if you are a principal right here, if you are the real estate broker or sales agent, you have to disclose. And if it comes out afterward, you go ahead and get ready for the ethics complaint.
Where do we find, well, I know we're finding all like other ethics rules.
We
For NAR and.
no, the NAR, we all follow the NAR's code. We are going to do some classes on those because there's a difference between the code and then what the principles are, what their SOPs are, standard operating principles. Okay. This should go with the original offer if you represent the buyer. If you represent the seller, it's becoming more common to see this uploaded as an attached document on the MLS. And then in the agent remarks, include the attached disclosure of interest. I get annoyed when I've seen listings where it says disclosure of interest is required. And they expect the buyer agent to fill it out. I don't know what they're to put in there. I'm not calling the other agent and doing their homework for them. If you're the listing agent, get it ready, make it available.
I mean, I saw Craig's listing for his parents and he just put it right in the listing,
Yep,
Mhm.
that. Like, not even that they just related, he put like. The son was the agent,
yeah, and the remarks, yeah.
he just flat
I
out.
see that a lot,
disclosed the relationship.
but then he would have also had to fill this out.
Well,
Yeah. And he had this filled out. I've seen listings where in the agent remarks, it just says, agent is related to seller, please provide a disclosure of interest, and there's not one there. I don't know how to mark that because
Yeah,
frankly, it's not my job to do the listing agent's addendum.
No.
Make the ethics violation theirs, not yours. Is my advice. They're responsible for disclosing it in writing, not you.
Yeah,
But if you have the listing, absolutely put it up there. Save yourself the headache.
Yeah.
It's also a good way to see who pays attention as a buyer agent when the offers come in, which buyer agent paid attention to the instructions to include this? Are they really paying attention to the details?
because as a buyer's agent, you're gonna have to have your clients sign that, so hopefully it's attached to the listing.
With it attached to the listing, this should absolutely be attached to the original FCA offer.
so if you were the listing agent, would you just have this like in the MLS as a
Mhm.
document all ready to go?
I did this with my son and daughter-in-law's condo. It was already uploaded, ready to go. So I'd already marked that this is an addendum to the real estate actually, I left that, left the offer reference date blank, put in the seller's name, put in my relationship to the seller as a relative, marked all that, and then left the rest of it blank because then they can put in their buyer name and what they need to.
Yeah.
And then see if they follow through on the agent remarks, on the instructions, include the attached disclosure of interest. Okay, we're gonna get into the next one we're gonna do. Any questions from those who are watching online? Let me see. Okay, we're gonna switch over to today's training was about doing open houses. It is not uncommon to have someone walk through an open house that's an unrepresented buyer. It may be a neighbor that's interested, maybe a buyer who's just kicking around, saw the open house signs, and they look at it and decide, I like the house. But they don't want to work with an agent. That's fine. This disclosure is to the buyer, explaining to the buyer what their responsibilities will be if they choose to be unrepresented and the potential legal consequences. First and foremost, that the seller's agent only acts on behalf of the seller. So if you're at an open house and somebody comes through unrepresented and asks questions, absolutely answer them. If they want you to write the offer, Sarah,
Then you would have to have them sign an agreement that you were representing.
like you said, Ty, you're going to have that agreement because now you're working in a limited agency.
Yeah.
If they start asking you questions about the process and how to do that, how would you answer it?
About the process?
Yeah, how do I write an offer on this, but I don't want to have an agent?
I had
Oh.
someone walk up to me and ask me that question now.
You can legally get yourself into a
Like,
little bit of a,
with an agent.
yeah, first of all, why don't you want to work with an agent?
Yeah,
But second of all, you can get yourself into legal trouble with that because as soon as you begin answering questions about the contract and the process, the courts have ruled that you are now in an implied agency relationship, and you'd have to have the limited disclosure. And if they choose to do something based on your advice that your seller disagrees with, or that is contrary to your seller's requirements, you've now violated the the signed agency with your seller. So this is where we're saying to the buyer, if you choose not to work with an agent, you are on your own.
You keep one of these with you at an open house?
I haven't in the past, but it's a good thing to consider. And if they want to know. Trying to get in and want to know where to get the contract, we can tell them they can get the contract online on the division's website. Or here's a copy with my seller, blank with the seller's name filled in properly. But in terms of filling this out, you're on your own.
So, wait.
This
when
is,
would you use this?
so if you're at an open house. And a buyer, or you have a listing and a buyer comes to you that has no representation. This is telling the buyer, if you choose to be unrepresented, this is what's happening.
So is this required in the same sense that a representation agreement is required when putting in an offer?
Essentially, this is their representation agreement. They're agreeing to represent themselves.
So they either have to have a representation agreement with an agent or an unrepresented buyer disclosure to submit an offer.
Yes,
You have to have one or the other.
yeah. If they told me they're unrepresented and they bring me an offer, then absolutely I'm sending this to them and saying, this offer is not complete without it.
Which is so ironic because it's like, you want to represent yourself, but you don't know how. So I'm gonna have to help you by sending you this form that you should.
Yeah, that you don't even know exists because
you don't.
you're unrepresented. This should be enough of an eye opener here as to why you should be represented.
But theoretically, if you took the time to explain this to somebody, it could be an opportunity to represent them.
Hopefully.
Absolutely, I would use it as an
It's still an
opportunity.
Opportunity, because they're either gonna let you or they're gonna go.
Yeah, but you're right, Ty. This is a good opportunity one more time to try to win that representation.
Yeah,
And even if it's not you, if you got another agent there it's your listing and I've got, Ty, it's your listing and Sarah's there with you, handing it off to Sarah so that the limited agencies at the brokerage level at least.
yeah.
I mean,
I
that would
would
be the
ask
next
them.
step, right? If they wanted maybe an agent, but they didn't want you to represent both sides. Then you just call
I would
someone
definitely,
here.
Yep,
yeah,
calling it back up.
because doing it yourself is just messy. I would never want to do that.
Yep. And that's why this is where anything you see in all caps in a memo in anything. This is old school style of writing. I know nowadays all caps usually means somebody's yelling at you, flaming. But in the legal world and in the world of business writing, if it's in all caps, it's a memo and this says, even if you only glanced over at everything else, pay attention to the following. By signing this unrepresented buyer disclosure, the buyer acknowledges and agrees that the agent and the company will only represent the seller in this transaction as a seller's agent. That's it. Here's your agency agreement. You represent yourself. You are on your own. Let the chips fall where they may. And as a listing agent, and if I receive this next to an offer from an agent, I need to have my seller understand that this person is doing this on their own. They've never done this before, or they may have done it a couple of times. They don't have the expertise. This buyer has chosen to work with an agent that has the expertise. It's up to you to decide what level of risk you want to take from here out on how this plays out. I didn't tell him not to take this. I'm just telling him, predicting the potential consequences. On the other side, if it's a for sale by owner, an unrepresented seller, and we represent the buyer, we want to get paid, right? Because working with FSBOs is a lot of extra work. Because they probably don't know what they're doing either. And so this, first and foremost, establishes the brokerage fee right here. Either as a flat fee or percentage, whatever you negotiate with that for sale by owner. Some for sale by owner listings, you look at it, will say they've already offered If working with the buyer agent, seller agrees to pay this amount. Some for sale by owners you'll see online will just say flat out, will not work with buyer's agent. It does provide a protection period, just like a standard listing, a standard representation contract will. So if your buyer decides to wait it out and then go back and do it on their own, try to go in as an unrepresented buyer, the for sale by owner says, hey, if you buy it without your agent, they'll knock off 3% on the price. Great, they can knock off 3% of the price, but they still owe you the amount. That was weird.
I heard it a little while ago too.
No?
The rest of this is exactly the same way you see it in the agency agreements. That there's warranties and disclosure, that the seller's going to follow through on fulfilling the disclosure requirements. They may not even know what those disclosure requirements are. And as the representative of the buyer, I can get myself into a little bit of trouble if I say, by the way, here's a copy of the property condition disclosures, lead-based paint, all those other things that you should have known that you didn't know about, because now I'm acting in an agency relationship with them. However, if I send them an email and say, my buyer has requested that you provide the following, now you're acting on your buyer's behalf and politely telling them you need this paperwork. You're contractually obligated to provide it.
I mean, to an extent, you kind of have to do that work to represent your client.
Yeah.
Fully.
Yeah, if you didn't hear Ty said, you kind of feel like you, to an extent, you have to do this, the other side of the work, and you do, because your buyer has a contractual obligation to receive property condition disclosures, CC&Rs, lead-based paint, title report, all those kind of things that for sale by owner may not recognize they need to provide. They may not have even talked to a title company before yet and asked for a title report. Yep. This does go through the dispute same about professional advice, dispute resolution. If there is a dispute, we prefer to go to mediation first, then arbitration. Seller authorizations. Because this was listed as for sale by owner, it's not going to show up on the MLS. This authorizes you as the agent after settlement to post on the MLS the basic information of the home, address, tax ID number, purchase price, and then you could, bedrooms, bathrooms, whatever. You don't have to worry about filling out all the rest of it. But at the bottom where it says listing agent brokerage and selling or buying agent brokerage, you just put unrepresented seller and then put your name in there as the buying agent.
Can't see it all the way from here, but do they have the ability to decline that?
They can, but since it is part of the contract right here, for them to decline it actually requires them to write a counteroffer to decline it, which they may or may not know how to do. Probably not. You're right, Ty. Probably not.
I just wondered if they had any opportunity to object to that happening.
They can object to anything in there. They need to know how to do it.
I guess I wanted to know if they had an easy objection.
There really isn't. It's like any other part. They can't just cross. And if they try to cross it off and say, I don't want this, they need to understand you can't cross anything out on this contract. You have to do an addendum. This is also for benefit for you, because this is then when people look up, they look researching you as an agent. They look on the MLS how many deals you've done. This will show up this way. If it's never put there, they don't know that you've done the deal.
That's why I wanted to know if they could.
They can. It's up to them. I've dealt with one for sale by owner that went sideways lots of different ways. Ultimately, in the end, we still posted it because we wanted proof we'd done it. Yeah. Okay. And like everything else, has to be signed by the buyer and the seller. This one has come up a couple of times recently. You sign an EBB, a buyer broker agency agreement with your client for a 3% commission. You look online and the offered BAC, buyer agent commission, is 2.5%. What do you do about that 0.5% deficit?
Depends on who you are.
What do you mean, Ty?
I mean, you can request that your client makes it up. You can also try to counter offer it and like you can try and include it in the purchase from the other agent.
Okay.
Or you can be a really, really nice person that really, really loves your client and be out that 25%.
Okay, those are your options, yes. Occasionally, if you know your buyer and you know that your buyer is not in a position to make up the deficit, they're already on a razor thin edge anyway, then we have a fiduciary responsibility to do everything we can to get them to get the house. We may have to eat that 0.5%. You know that we cannot contact the seller's agent and request a change. This is a negotiation between buyer and seller. That's why this is a REPC to an addendum to the REPC. And that is where seller agrees to pay a dollar amount or percentage of purchase price to the buyer's brokerage to make up the difference.
Payment shall be made in addition to.
Any other compensation
So,
offered.
MLS says 2.
Correct.
we Put 1 in there.
Correct. You have to make up, this is making up the deficit between what the offered BAC is, because that's already an contractual obligation that already exists. This is to make up the deficit. And it's not uncommon to say, well, let's do this. I can offer you more for the house in order to make this work, the same way you would any other closing cost. It just doesn't show up on the MLS, it doesn't show up as a concession. If you offer more and ask for closing costs, you'll see that concession amount listed on the MLS.
Instead of that,
With this, because this is commission related, and this would not show up as a concession after closing on the MLS. I use the
should we
close
do it either way.
in order to get it, because this is between, goes to the brokerage, this is the form you're gonna be using, because this then goes, because remember, you can't receive the check. The principal broker can, and then it's distributed.
How about that? I've had
Correct.
stolen
Oh, I gotta love Alex's personality. In other words, they can't write a check directly to you to make up the difference. It goes to the brokerage. Basically, at settlement, what happens then is you basically end up with one check comes from title instead of one for this amount and one for this amount.
So this is a little left field,
Yeah,
but do you foresee with all of the pending issues with commission going on right now, that this is the route that it would end up going if some of those ones?
depending on, yeah, it will depend on how that litigation plays out. And NAR still has said that they anticipate it still being years before this litigation plays out. And if there's a change in the administration, it could get dropped completely because with change in the Department of Justice, they may decide it's not worth the effort. Now, there are a couple of groups who have sued about it and consistently lost because all they did was walk in and say, look, here's a random sampling of what's on our local MLS and all the offered BACs. They're all different. In the event that that does change, then yes, NAR is going to have to come up with a policy agreement. There's going to have to be time for the local boards to figure out what they're going to do. And we'll probably see something like this that then becomes part of the contract.
And then it will essentially,
become a free-for-all.
yeah,
You'll see how low people will, how low will you go to get the business?
I mean, I follow a lot of, um, a lot of pages and forums, and things of
Mhm.
agents. I read a lot of discussions on commission.
This has been a practice, it's a multi-generational practice. Suddenly just trying to dismantle it because of one court ruling is going to be very difficult.
Well,
Ultimately-
a brokerage is based on these numbers that we've been kind of historically expecting somewhat for a number of years, and that would change the whole industry so much, it would take years to adjust, and it's not gonna be a quick change.
And because disposition of personal property is under state law, not federal law, it will take at least two different district courts to have contradictory rulings before the Supreme Court will even consider taking it. Because this is not this is not an area where the Supreme Court is the court of initial or primary jurisdiction. They'll have to wait to have at least two contradictory rulings at the circuit court level. Preferably two very different circuits, like the Ninth Circuit in California that is extremely one direction, and the First Circuit Court on the East Coast is extremely a different direction, and preferably then one from the middle of the country. And then you've got three different parts of the country under three different sets of rulings, some of which some districts only cover part of a state. So now you're facing with half the state would have to follow one rule, half the state another rule. Now it's getting too confusing. Now we'd have to step in on a federal level and make some kind of ruling.
So I've noticed. Go back to where
Yeah.
I've noticed a lot more lately that a lot of them are at 2%, not even 2.5.
That's part of the market. That has started to happen. I was looking at one anywhere from, I did like a 2.85 this morning. There is a brokerage here that is one of those that will call for sale by owners and say, oh, you offer a 3% commission. Here's what I'll do. I'll go ahead and represent you, but you do all the work. I'll just make sure the paperwork clears.
Can't tell you the name of that brokerage, but it's favorite color is teal.
Actually, no, this one was, favorite name is Intermountain.
Oh, got it.
So they offer a 3% BAC, fine, I'll take 1% and offer 2%, or I'll take 1.5% and offer 2%, or whatever it adds up to the other way. And you read the instructions and you have to contact them. Everything has to go through the seller. All that they bought for their percentage was getting on the MLS. This is how one brokerage started that has laid off a significant portion of their sales force lately.
So, I mean,
It's up to you. There are some caveats with this as well. You need to understand that VA loan requirements will not allow the buyer to pay commission outside of closing. So if it's listed at 2.5% and the seller want to negotiate, you don't have an option. And that's one of the concerns about the litigation. Now you've got the VA that is nationwide, is a federal organization, would have to rewrite all their rules about commission. And in a zero down payment setting, they probably don't have 3% to pay a commission.
do you think that this is something that usually goes through, or do you think it's something they usually try to fight?
This is something you need to have a conversation with the seller's agent very early on about. And if they're going to fight it, and and it's a dramatic difference between what's being offered and what the percentage is on the EVB, then you'll have to have that serious conversation with your buyer. Say that we can include this as a closing cost. But feel this out very early on. Don't just randomly, I wouldn't just randomly throw this in with an offer. It'd be like waving a huge red flag in their face.
You give the agent a heads up like that you will be including it
Well,
with the offer.
give them a heads up and do those verbal negotiations or text negotiations before I do this, so that when this comes in, it's what's been agreed to already. This is just memorializing an agreement that's already been made. And part of the contract, we got like a minute to go, so. So yeah, that's a good question to have, a good to ask. And ultimately it may be. It comes down to, it's not, yeah. I've looked at some deals going, look, I know I'm starving, but I'm not giving my services away.
Yeah.
I've got to cover my bills too. And you wouldn't ask you wouldn't negotiate with your thoracic surgeon to cut his fee to do open heart surgery. I am a professional.
Mhm.
Okay.
That one came up for me, and I was going to be able, the sellers were gonna pay the increase the closing costs to cover
Mhm.
the difference, but then it didn't appraise. So we had to rework everything and then
Yep.
had to be